The iPhone 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max launched the fall of 2022 as Apple's headlining flagship smartphones alongside the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. The 14 Pro was extremely similar to its predecessor, the 13 Pro, at least cosmetically, with the exact same design, which also looked extremely similar to the 12 Pro, which also doesn't look a whole lot different from the 15 Pro, at least from the back. Even so, there's still more to this story, with ProMotion coming on the 13 Pro, and with the 14 Pro we got the all-new Dynamic Island, a pill-shaped cutout replacing the infamous notch outright. We also got the typical improvements in power and photography, with the main jump being the now 48 megapixel wide sensor, allowing for even more detail than ever possible before to be captured on an iPhone. And all in all, the 14 Pro and Pro Max made for some impressive smartphones that, while expensive, certainly managed to live up to their Pro name. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and we're fast approaching the 2-year mark of the 14 Pro's existence, which is honestly hard to believe. The phone certainly doesn't feel a couple years old, helped massively by how similar it is to the 15 Pro, a phone that switched from stainless steel to titanium and added USB-C, and well, there's probably some other stuff in there too, but those were the highlights. It just goes to show how little is changing year to year for smartphones these days, as they're already so good, and the changes that are being made aren't always for the better. USB-C is awesome, although some out there might still prefer their old lightning cables, but the titanium is certainly more debatable, as it doesn't necessarily feel like an upgrade per se, but more just a change for the sake of change. In fact, the 15 Pro is seemingly a bit less durable than the 14 Pro, which might make the 14 Pro and its stainless steel an even more enticing option than its successor. But of course, with every new Pro iPhone, Apple outright discontinues the previous one, making the 14 Pro only available on the used market at this point, as well as maybe the rare retailer that somehow still has some in stock. And as of making this video in only a few months' time, the 15 Pro itself will also be discontinued, with the 16 Pro coming out. While buying used isn't always ideal, it's definitely better for the wallet, and on eBay.com and USD, the 14 Pro comes in as low as like $600, sometimes even under, which is rare, at least in good condition, and for a phone of this caliber, that's honestly a heck of a deal. So in this video, we're going to be discussing the iPhone 14 Pro about 2 years later, and whether or not, of course, it's still worth buying, which I really think it is. It might even be more worth buying than the 15 Pro or upcoming 16 Pro, if only for the fact that you'll likely end up paying almost half the price versus buying straight from Apple brand new. Heck, the 14 Pro has mainly the same hardware as in the current iPhone 15 and 15 Plus, phones that right now would run you $800 or $900 while having only a 60Hz display, as well as only 2 camera lenses on the back. It's actually crazy how much better of a deal buying the iPhone 14 Pro is, buying used, compared to buying a brand new iPhone 15 or even 14. It just requires more effort as you scour eBay or local marketplaces such as, I don't know, Facebook Marketplace, in order to hopefully find the best possible deal on a device that's ideally in good condition with solid battery health. So it's worth watching out for. But let's back up a bit here and look at the 14 Pro itself a bit closer, then we'll come back to its enticing value proposition a bit later on. I myself purchased the 14 Pro in its beautiful purple color back when it launched in 2022, and I used it for a year before moving to the 15 Pro Max. At this point, that 14 Pro actually went to my aunt, who does not need a phone that good, but loves it, like absolutely loves it. She wanted a phone that would last her like 5 years, and I figured, hey, the 14 Pro probably can do that, so she's using it. It's completely overkill, but she loves the camera, she loves everything about it, and it's working great. But myself, moving to the 15 Pro Max, my personal favorite feature on the new phone actually had very little to do with what Apple changed, so much as just the larger size, since I went for the Max option this time. I quite like that, but the experience itself, from phone to phone, is practically identical, which isn't a bad thing, mind you, because I absolutely loved my 14 Pro, just like I absolutely loved my 13 Pro from the year prior, which also felt almost identical. The 14 Pro came in at 2 size options with 6.1 inches and 6.7 inches. The 14 Pro Max on the right there is actually my mom's, which she bought at launch and is still happily using today. She loves the cameras in particular. There's a variety of colors here with your standard options in black, white, and gold, and then we also do get that beautiful purple, which was unique to this model. And naturally, the biggest new feature is on the front with that dynamic island, so let's take a little time to talk about it. Initially, I thought it was a cool gimmick, something that does add to the experience, but is by no means a necessity. And I mean, truthfully, that hasn't changed. But I'd add that it's also a very underrated feature, and one I do really love to have. When you're playing media, it's visible on the dynamic island. Having it accessible there at all times on the screen, regardless of what you're doing and whether it's video or music, is just a fantastically convenient feature and one that blends perfectly into the rest of iOS. Some may criticize the dynamic island for being intrusive, and that's not without its merit. As an easy example, the notch cuts into video playing at a 2:1 aspect ratio just slightly, whereas the 13 Pro and its reduced notch size actually sits higher on the display and doesn't cut into the video. This is admittedly kind of annoying, and it means there's different situations where we have a little less screen real estate than we would otherwise. However, as silly as this choice from Apple might seem, I think it's all absolutely worth it for the good that comes with the dynamic island. Yes, it's a bit of a silly name, but as reviewers said when the 14 Pro first came out, it's a feature that's kind of worthy of the name. It just brings iOS to another level that, in conjunction with the ProMotion display, makes everything feel and work better, smoother, and more intuitively than ever before. Even just swiping away from an application that's playing some media and seeing it disappear seamlessly into the dynamic island just makes for this flow that's so fluid and enjoyable to use. It has this dynamic island blending into the background but also being a centerpiece of the iOS experience. To quote the great Todd Howard, it all just works. And while I do think this is a feature I could live without if I were to switch back to my old iPhone 13 Pro, it is a feature I would dearly miss. Now, one feature I couldn't live without at this point, or at least would very much prefer not to, is ProMotion, which raised the display's refresh rate to 120 Hz and came on the 13 Pro. It's of course on the 14 Pro and the 15 Pro, but notably, it's not on the regular iPhone 14 or 15. Basically, ProMotion doubles the frame rate, and it's a bit difficult to express on a YouTube video if you're unfamiliar with it, so I would suggest trying out a non-Pro versus a Pro iPhone in a store to see the difference for yourself if you're interested. It has iOS feeling buttery smooth, but I will admit, as much as I love it, it doesn't provide a ton of practical functionality aside from the fluidity. If you game on mobile, it helps there, since you get 120 frames per second versus 60. But beyond that, most people don't really need those extra frames for basic tasks, like, you know, texting people or checking social media or whatever else you do on your phone. Still, one thing we did get with the 14 Pro that was new over the 13 Pro is the always-on display, which takes advantage of the variable refresh rate to essentially be able to do 1 frame per second and have your clock on the screen and some notification information when your phone's asleep. The always-on display is something I do really like. It's again kind of like the dynamic island, not a necessity, but just nice to have. It has been a feature on Android for years, yes, but I'm glad Apple finally brought it to iPhone, and it's something you'll probably enjoy if you get one of the newer models. Design-wise, as mentioned, the iPhone 14 Pro is basically identical to the 13 Pro in almost every way. It's a bit thicker, the cameras are even bigger, we've got that stainless steel frame which is just beautiful, and the frosted glass on the back, making for truly a pro experience. Of course, again, the 13 Pro looked identical to the 12 Pro practically, so this design was used for basically 3 years. The 15 Pro also looks similar, but it did move to titanium, so it's technically different. As mentioned, we don't get USB-C here, it's still Lightning, and the phone itself is very chunky. One thing the 15 Pro did do that I liked over the 14 Pro is actually make the phone thinner and lighter, which is kind of a rarity in modern iPhones, as Apple's been making them bigger for years in order to hopefully produce more battery life. The battery on the 14 Pro for me was always fantastic, and it'll probably be that way for most people, at least getting you a day out of it, I would think, especially on the Pro Max, which is identical to the 14 Pro, but is bigger, so does have a bigger battery. Now, of course, these phones have been used for almost 2 years, so battery health might be starting to degrade, and you can check that in settings, battery health, and that percentage there will give you an indication of how much of the original capacity can be used. Your phone will tell you when your battery needs replaced, but generally around 80% you're going to notice that it's not as good as it used to be, especially in combination with more and more iOS updates that might make things even worse. So down the line, you might want to look at a battery replacement, which Apple will do for a fee, but it can be worth doing if you need it, and it's all powered by the A16 Bionic chipset along with 6 GB of RAM. Trust me, everything still runs very fast on this phone, there's nothing to worry about there. Apple's great with optimization. For storage, you can get up to 1 terabyte, along with 128 or 256 gigabytes. And it's notable that if you're in the US, you probably don't have a SIM tray on here. This was new with the 14 Pro. Apple dropped the SIM tray for eSIM, but if you're not in the US, you probably do still have a SIM tray, as I myself did, being from Canada. eSIM is actually really convenient and not something to worry about, although I personally do prefer having the physical option, so it comes down to personal taste, but I wouldn't worry about it if you are concerned. eSIM works really well. Let's talk about the cameras, because along with the dynamic island, it was easily the biggest new upgrade on the 14 Pro, just like the cameras were one of the biggest upgrades on the 13 Pro, and the 12 Pro, and the 11 Pro, and you kind of get the idea here. Apple does this every single year. The cameras are always the centerpiece of these Pro iPhones, and for good reason. They're always great, and it's no exception on the iPhone 14 Pro. We've got 3 lenses, with the main wide 48 megapixel lens, as well as the ultra wide 12 megapixel lens, providing that 0.5 times zoom, and then the telephoto 3 times zoom lens, which can also provide really nice photos. Now, one thing the 15 Pro did, or specifically the 15 Pro Max did, was add a 5x lens, giving 5 times zoom. That is only on the 15 Pro Max. The regular 15 Pro still does 3x zoom. Honestly, there's pros and cons to having 3x versus 5x. For me, I don't really care that much. It's not a big deal, and I wouldn't worry about it if you are looking at the 14 Pro. And photos here are great. Of course, there's only 3 lenses, but there's actually 4 buttons there on the camera app for just zooming around with that 2x option. That wasn't on the 13 Pro, and what it basically does is crop in the 48 megapixel sensor to 12 megapixels, thus giving you 2x zoom. I do use it quite often myself, and it's nice to have here. More versatility is always great, and overall this camera is certainly versatile. I got a lot of good photos out of it over the year that I had the phone. Whether in good lighting or bad lighting conditions, it always seemed to just nail pictures. It really did. And you've got a plethora of RAW and ProRes options if that's something that you're interested in. You can of course record video at 4K 60. There's a selfie camera, which is 12 megapixels. It's pretty standard stuff, and the photos are gonna look great. They truly are. This thing, the cameras are absolutely one of its best qualities. And when I first got the phone, I was admittedly pretty blown away by just how well it performed, especially in those lower light situations. Mind you, the 13 Pro also blew me away with how well it did, but that's the thing. Phones are just so good now that a phone like this, that's almost a couple years old, can still produce some amazing quality pictures. And considering the price point it's at, it's really hard to complain about any of this. And so let's talk about that price point, shall we? If you want to actually buy this phone, you're gonna have to go to the used market. You're probably not gonna see this on Apple's own refurbished section for a while. Even right now, as of making this video, it's all iPhone 12 Pros there. It changes, so it might be worth checking out, but I've never personally seen a 14 Pro on there yet. So you're probably looking at something like eBay.com or Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, that sort of thing. If we do again look at eBay.com, I was seeing that phone for around 600 bucks USD, which is pretty darn good for what it is. In good condition, 128 gigs, not too bad at all. And the Pro Max was about 50 to 100 bucks past that. This is an awesome phone, and I think that's a really good price. The 13 Pro was about $150 less, and I've done a review on that if you want to see that. I'll link it in the description. It's a very similar phone, but you do get those nice little upgrades like the dynamic island with the 14 Pro that might make that extra cash worth it, as well as the 48 megapixel sensor versus only 12 on the 13 Pro, which doesn't make as much of a difference as you might expect, but is still nice to have on the newer model. And of course, you're probably also looking at an extra year of iOS support. This is not something we need to worry about now, but assuming the phone gets 6 years of iOS support, which it could get longer, could technically get shorter, but that's pretty unlikely. We're likely looking at getting up to about iOS 21 or so, being the final major update for the 14 Pro. So yeah, probably a good half decade of updates still remaining. I wouldn't worry about that anytime soon. And all this culminates in what is still a very much pro experience in 2024 and no doubt beyond. The iPhone 14 Pro feels like a pro iPhone. It feels like a flagship iPhone. It doesn't feel like a phone that's approaching 2 years old. It is amazing. It is a phone that I could still be using right now instead of my 15 Pro and have zero issues with. All I would miss is what, the USB-C, and that's about it. It's crazy how little is changing year to year these days, and it makes for the 14 Pro being one of the best value smartphones, or at least iPhones, that you can probably buy right now if you're okay with buying from the used market, because there is some risk that comes with that inherently. Even so, I'd recommend this phone for anybody who's interested, and I'd also love to hear from those of you who have one right now. How's it working for you? Would you recommend someone else buy it? Make sure you leave a comment down below, both for myself as well as for those who might be interested in purchasing one for themselves. And yeah, with that, I think I'm right about done here. Not a whole lot to say because the phone is so great, but I definitely wanted to revisit it simply because I think it's worth talking about. I think it's worth pointing out how great these older Pro phones are, and it's almost a pity Apple doesn't still sell them. Well, I mean, there's a reason they don't sell them, right? It would probably outsell the iPhone 14 or the 15 simply because it's significantly better value. ProMotion alone makes it worth it for me over something like the 14 or the 15, and the lack of changes year to year make for this phone holding up about as well as you could possibly hope for. If you found this video helpful or interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content. Thank you so much for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.